Good evening, and thank you for joining us. You're among a large group of people who are eager to hear from our presenters tonight. But first, we want to take a moment to talk about the difficulties that Minnesota is experiencing this week. The loss of Renee Good is a tragedy that has affected Minnesotans across the state and Americans across the country. It's a reminder and a cautionary moment of what happens when fear is used to try to stifle and weaken democratic processes. But Minnesotans have shown up and shown what we're made of and insist that democracy is here for all of us. It's this commitment to a safe and fair and inclusive society and elections that brings us together tonight. Clean Elections Minnesota is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that works to build a healthy and inclusive democracy. We do this by trying to limit the impact of big money in politics and expanding and protecting voter access. As a nonpartisan organization, Clean Elections Minnesota does not endorse political candidates, and tonight's speakers will be appearing in their official capacities to discuss issues affecting Minnesota's elections. We at Clean Elections Minnesota, along with our co-hosts, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause Minnesota, Fair Vote Minnesota, have worked together to get common sense legislation passed to make voting easier for eligible citizens in Minnesota and to assure Minnesotans that our voting processes are clean, fair, accurate, and secure. I should also point out that Common Cause and the League of Women Voters have both asked to intervene in the case of the U.S. Justice Department suing the state of Minnesota for our voting records. You'll be hearing more about that case later on this evening in our discussion. Since taking office, the Trump administration has amplified their concerns about the integrity of the American electoral system without citing specific evidence of widespread flaws. Critics accuse the administration of trying to use the power of the presidency to interfere with the 2026 elections. For their part, the administration officials claim they are simply trying to ensure confidence in those elections. In tonight's program, we're going to hear from Attorney General Keith Ellison and Secretary of State Steve Simon about what actions the administration has taken against Minnesota and how and why those efforts are being resisted. We are so grateful that tonight's conversation is being moderated by prize-winning journalist and author Lori Sturdevant. Lori?
Well, thank you, Mary, and hello, everyone. What a time we are having here in Minnesota. As most of our listeners know, I'm sure the U.S. Constitution makes the conduct and administration of elections a state responsibility. And yet, here we are tonight in federally occupied Minnesota to discuss the potential for federal involvement, be it interference or something even more sinister, in the election that is scheduled for November 3rd of this year, just 10 months from now. So I am very glad to be joined by these two elected officials tonight, both veterans in public service, both deeply knowledgeable about state and federal election law, and both with a history of standing up to the Trump administration and maybe some battle scars to show it. I think you both will be able to help us understand what's fact and what's fiction as we seek to ensure that this year's elections will be up to Minnesota's high historic standards of excellence. So, Secretary Simon, Attorney General Ellison, hello. Did I tell it true? Is the administration of elections purely a state responsibility? And what is the president up to that makes us think that it could be otherwise this year? Secretary Simon, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, the Constitution, first of all, thank you to Clean Elections Minnesota and all the co-sponsors and everyone who showed up tonight. It's really an honor to be with you, to be back with you. I really appreciate it. Yeah, the Constitution couldn't be much clearer. Article 1, Section 4 says states are in charge of the time, place, and manner of elections, except that Congress can step in. Congress has that authority, and it's exercised that authority periodically, most famously with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then since then, and I know that then Congressman Keith Ellison was one of the moving forces in Congress in trying to protect the Voting Rights Act. But that's an example of the sort of sharing of power we have. The Constitution says nothing, not one word about a president of the United States, this one or anyone, waving a magic wand in the Oval Office through an executive order or by other means and asserting power or control over state administration of elections. We can have the policy debates all day long, and we should, about election policy. But if the president wants to affect change in election policy, he should do it the old-fashioned way and the constitutional way, which is to get a law passed and sign it into law. He's not doing that. He's attempted to do it in other ways, either through the courts or through executive orders. And Attorney General Ellison has been a great partner with our office in pushing back against exactly that with great success.
Well, how about that, Attorney General Ellison, though the president does have sort of sweeping emergency powers to declare an emergency. Could he declare an emergency that would postpone or stop an election anywhere in the country?
These days, Lori, let me tell you, anything is possible, but within 15 minutes we'll be in court if he tries. I mean, the bottom line is he's tried to say that he can raise taxes and do tariffs, which also are congressional responsibilities, all based on emergencies. But these matters have been litigated and we've taken them up to the highest courts of the land. We're in a situation where the president might declare an emergency for any given matter, but that doesn't mean courts have to find that that's accurate. Courts have found when it came to him trying to invoke the power of state National Guards and other institutions, tariffs, other things, that his claim of a crisis or something like that simply was not warranted and supported by the facts. So I can't tell you what he's going to do, but I can sure tell you what we're going to do. We're going to defend this state in court, and we're up to it. We have a whole unit devoted to it. We're not tired at all. We got a lot of gas in the tank.
Well, and I admire that you have shown that already, something like, what, 3 dozen, or is it 4 dozen by now, times already in just the last year, taking this president to court, either by yourself as the state of Minnesota or in concert with other states.
4 dozen plus 2.
But how satisfied are you that the courts would respond quickly? That's been part of our frustration, is the courts sometimes move slower than we'd like to see.
That's true, but we have gotten things out of them fairly quickly. Today, we filed a case on just a couple of days ago, hoping for a temporary restraining order. We didn't get it, but we will be in court on a preliminary injunction on the 23rd of January. This is on this question of whether the metro surge is legally justifiable. And again, so we wanted to get in quicker than we've gotten in, but we're not at all discouraged. In fact, Judge Menendez is very well known to be thoughtful, careful, and she's an I dotter and a T crosser. So it's probably a good thing she's taking the time.
Yeah. Well, listen, friends, tonight I want to go through the kind of the litany of various moves and threatened moves by the Trump administration that would affect our elections, or that it seemed intended to do so. And I want to start with what looked to the one move that looked to me to have the most direct implications for Minnesota, and tell me if I'm wrong about that assessment. But the federal demand for the state to turn over voter registration records, which, Secretary Simon, you've been kind of carrying the ball on that. Where do things stand with this demand to turn over a wholesale amount of data to the federal government from our election rolls? Where does that stand?
Yeah, well, just to level set here so everyone's on the same page. What the federal government has asked for from us and a total of 42 states, so we're in very good company, almost all states, 42, they don't just want the regular voter rolls that political campaigns and political parties can get. They want everything. All the personal information, the very sensitive data, things like driver's license numbers, social security numbers, military service information where applicable. That's a really big deal. And our response, working in tandem with Attorney General Ellison and his team, is based on the law. Look at the state and federal law. Forget our policy preferences and all the rest. Look at the law. And the law says that they don't get that stuff unless they do at least 2 things. First, they got to say with some detail why they need this. How does it relate to their stated purpose? And second, they've got to tell us what they're going to do with it. How are you going to store it, keep it, transmit it? Who are you going to share it with? They haven't done any of that stuff. So we push back. We've been sued. And by the way, just a little time out here on being sued. And Attorney General Ellison does this for a living every day. He sues and he is sued. But, sometimes there's a stigma about, oh, my such and such was sued or such and such was in court. It should be in court. We have a legal position. The federal government has another legal position. In a civilized country, we don't duke it out in the streets. We go to a court of law. Of course, we're going to abide by what the court says. Of course, we will. But we'll see what the court says about that. I should point out, when you say, where does it stand? Right now, we're in the very beginning of a litigation in district court in Minnesota. The feds have sued not just Minnesota, but 23 other states. I think they're up to 24. And just so folks know, out of the 42 states that I've mentioned that have been served with this request for all this very personal, sensitive data on millions and millions of people, only 7 states have given them what they want. 35 states, like Minnesota, have not, including blue states, red states, other states in between. So we're in good company on a number of levels.
Well, and Mr. Secretary, what is their stated purpose? What are they going for here?
Well, they say that they want to see whether we and other states are in compliance with the Help America Vote Act, which passed in 2002. And our read is simply that the Help America Vote Act says that states have to have a system in place for voter registration, for accurate, adequate voter registration, but it doesn't empower the federal government to be policing that. I mean, we have to have a system that's reasonable in place, but it doesn't give them power to start second guessing decisions and snooping around in people's personal records. And so that's our legal position, working with Attorney General Ellison's team. That's what they say it is. But what they're requesting doesn't really seem connected to what they're saying they need it for.
Okay, well, and I want to point out before I lose this thread that 2 of the co-sponsors of tonight's program, the Minnesota Common Cause and the Minnesota League of Women Voters, have asked to intervene on Minnesota's side in this case.
Right.
Attorney General Ellison, what would you observe about this lawsuit?
Well, just real quickly, first of all, as far as we can tell, and we've looked, this is unprecedented. We haven't seen this before. Maybe somebody else can add in, but as we've looked around and done our research, this is unprecedented. And then the other thing that's important to I mention is that the DOJ really has not identified their legal basis. The HAVA law, Help America Vote Act, requires that a system be in place that makes reasonable efforts to maintain accurate voter registration systems. It doesn't have a record disclosure provision. So what they're demanding, there's no legal mechanism for them to effectuate that. There is no records disclosure provision. We haven't said we'd give it to them. They didn't pass a law that said we had to. And then, the Secretary of State, and I'm just going to tell you all this, and I'd say this whether Steve was here or not, we do have the best Secretary of State in the United States. I hope people know that. It's a fact. And I'm so proud to work with him every day. But the Secretary's office has explained that, Minnesota's system in detail, and the DOJ does not allege that any part of the system violates the law.
Yep.
So I'll just say that, that's all I want to add on that. They don't have a legal basis to get what they're asking for, and we're not in the business of giving them things that they're not legally entitled to.
Yeah. Well, the next thing I want to ask about is this executive order that the president issued way back in March last year, that at the time I didn't get too excited about it because I thought it didn't quite apply to Minnesota. I remember it would require some proof of citizenship on a federal voter registration form that we don't use. It would prohibit the counting of ballots that are received, mailed in ballots received after Election Day, and we don't count those anyway. And it would ban the use of certain kinds of election machine-readable machines of the kind that we do our own certification anyway. So I thought, well, this isn't really about us. Then in April, though, a month later, Attorney General Ellison, you were among the attorneys general around the country who did try to sue to stop this order's enforcement. And you've had some success in the lower courts as recently as last week in Washington State, as I recall.
That's right.
What was of concern for you about this big election-related executive order back in March?
Well, let me just say more broadly, and just in general, overreach into areas where states have authority over elections is not something I'm going to sit around for.
Mhm.
So the federalism and the 10th Amendment depends upon the federal government staying in their lane. And then us as states, we stay in our lane. Trust me, if we start legislating in areas that they have jurisdiction over, they will get us for preemption and cite the supremacy clause. By the same token, we're not going to let them intrude into areas that are for the states to be in control over.
Mhm.
And then they have to operate. The federal government has a legal obligation to operate rationally.
Mhm.
When they operate in a way that's arbitrary and capricious, we're going to point it out. We're going to take them to court. And let me just tell you this, Lori, because I do get your question, and I've asked myself the same thing. If it really doesn't affect us, why would be concerned? Well, the answer is it does affect us generally, but with this particular president, this one, I just don't think. I just think we're dealing with somebody. If you give them a cookie, they're going to want a glass of milk, and you really should not just be handing them documents and not standing up to them when they're encroaching upon state authority.
Well, in addition to that executive order that he put forward in March, he's been talking about a whole lot of other stuff, like banning mail-in voting, right, Secretary Simon?
That's right. Yeah, he can't do that either, by the way. If he attempted to do that, he's threatened to do it. He says he's going to do another executive order. With Keith's help, we beat him once, and we'll beat him again on the same grounds that Keith just talked about. You simply can't, as President of the United States, wave a magic wand and start taking over the state election system. You can pass a law through Congress and then enact it, and then there's authority to do certain things. But on the mail-in voting, I think many people on this call probably know he's sort of gone back and forth on that. There are periods like when he's running for office where he's sort of persuaded to stay quiet about his opposition because from a partisan standpoint, there are folks on his side who want to use it. And it's increasingly popular in Minnesota, absentee voting generally and voting by mail in particular. But no, he doesn't have the authority to do that either. And we're confident that were he to try to do it, we could go to court and stop it.
Well, then I've been hearing noise about something that I've been hearing about for a long time. Republicans back in 1973, when I really wasn't covering the legislature yet, I was still in college, but I've written about it since. Back in 1973, Republicans didn't like the idea of election day registration, and they're still on that kick. And I know there was just recently in the last few weeks, the Department of Justice has asked you, Secretary Simon, to turn over some state records pertaining to
Yeah.
same-day voter registration. This is a very popular feature of the Minnesota elections law. Talk
Yeah.
about what's been going on in that whole realm, Secretary
Yeah,
Simon.
it's extremely popular. When I go around the state and I talk to people about same-day voter registration, it's such a part of our culture, passed or enacted in 1973. People can't imagine life without it here. When you tell people that in most of American states today, that if you're not registered to vote, say a month before the election, it's game over. It's an absolute cutoff. There's no such thing in most of America as registering to vote on Halloween. Doesn't exist. Can't do it because you missed the cutoff. And in Minnesota for 50 years plus, we've said, look, as long as you can show the stuff you need to show, you are who you say you are, you live where you say you live, it's fine by us if you do it on election day, and it's popular. Wildly popular. It's used by a lot of people for a lot of reasons. What you're referring to, January 2nd, we got a letter from the Department of Justice, and they're looking into one variant of it, which we call vouching in Minnesota, which we've also had since 1973, by the way.
Right.
And vouching, as some on this meeting might know, is the process by which a person can be vouched for as to their residence in a particular precinct. And this comes really in handy if someone just moved to the precinct or is in a senior or assisted living facility or a variety of other reasons. I have a personal stake in this, or not a stake, but a story. My parents, once upon a time, downsized from the house I grew up in, moved to a condo in Minneapolis, and they moved in, I think it was late September or early October of an election year.
Mhm.
They didn't have a new driver's license reflecting their new address. They didn't even have a utility bill. So my dad could not have voted in that election unless someone vouched for him. And vouching just means that a person in your precinct can go with you to the polling place, sign an oath under penalty of perjury that you really live where you say you live. All of it is logged, so you have the name of the voucher and the vouchee, and everything's checked on after the election. And there's an automatic, non-discretionary criminal referral if anyone did anything wrong. And I've never seen one in the time I've been in office. I've
Really?
never seen one with vouching. But Harmeet Dillon, the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, for some reason, believes that there's a problem with vouching and asks us to produce a bunch of documents. I won't do a spoiler alert because our letter back to her is due on Friday, and I don't want to say anything until we put the letter out with Keith and his team as well. But what I can tell you about vouching is it puzzles me that some people are skeptical in this sense. Vouching is a second layer of security, a second layer, whereas most states have only one layer. Take South Dakota and take my dad's situation. If someone like my dad in Sioux Falls had just moved in late September or early October, you know what their system is? The voter self-vouches. They self-attest. They sign an affidavit saying, look, I know I don't have any ID. I don't know I have a utility bill or anything else, but I promise under penalty of perjury, I really do live at 123 Maple Street. And that's fine. I'm not knocking it. I'm sure that's fine for South Dakota. Here we have in Minnesota through vouching a second layer of security. It's two layers, not one. You got to drag a neighbor in and they've got to attest under penalty of perjury. And so I'm scratching my head as to why some folks in some political quarters are objecting to this. I suppose they want us to have one layer, not two. I don't know.
Yeah. And Attorney General Ellison, is there anything particular about this feature of the election law system that would give the federal government authority to intrude?
No, but let me say this. This is a philosophical difference of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to have the safest, most secure elections that include the most people that are eligible to vote. That's what we're trying to do. We want people to participate. We think more participation is better. We think, whether your candidate wins or not, the fact that you've been able to go make your say so and register your opinion is a very important thing for our state.
Mm-hmm.
And some people just flat out don't agree with that. The whole their attack on our vouching system, I think, has more to do with them just trying to mess with Minnesota because it doesn't seem rational. As Steve said, it actually would have the reverse effect if based on what they seem like they're aiming for. But I just wanted to say that in Minnesota, we're proud that we have the highest voter turnout in the country. We don't have it every single year, but we generally do.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever we don't, Secretary Steinman is a little pissed off.
Well,
Sorry, Steve.
I did a book with the former Secretary of State a few years ago, and I know she felt strongly that this feature of our election law was responsible for our consistently high voter turnouts. And I think Secretary Simon, you would agree with that, right?
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean,
Secretary
think of
Simon,
all the
how many
people-
times have I heard you say that all members of the Minnesota congressional delegation voted for the 1965 Voting Rights Act? I mean, I don't want to take the line because I love to hear you say
No,
it.
you're
That's
right.
true.
No, that is true. And that was
true.
something that it was a particular feather in the cap of Republican future Governor Al Quie.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so what are you expecting from the president on these fronts as he gets people stirred up about vouching and same-day registration? Secretary Simon, are you looking for some kind of executive order? What do you think is coming here?
It's possible. I think there's going to be more litigation, and we're in the capable, able hands of Keith and his team. There might be more executive orders. I don't know. I want to say, without predicting it, I want to say that one of the things that's on our radar screen that I've been asked a lot about, I can't tell you how many times in the last year I've been asked by very serious people, are we really going to have free and fair elections in 2026? People are concerned that there might be some pretext or excuse to interfere directly or indirectly with the elections, whether that's by confiscating elections equipment or sending federal personnel in and around polling places. That fear is out there. And while I'm not predicting it, I am saying that what we and other states are doing are planning for those kinds of scenarios. It's like anything else in life. You have to hope for the best and plan for the worst. That's just proper in any line of work. And whether it's a tornado or a bomb threat or a president of the United States doing something like this, we have to plan for that stuff. And we actively are with national partners, with other states, sort of gaming out what would happen, what tools we have in the toolbox to confront something like that. Again, not a prediction, but it's on the table, and it's something it would be irresponsible not to at least have those discussions and plan for it.
Well, thank you for raising that, which I think addresses a concern that's very much on the minds of our audience tonight. What would happen? Is it legitimate under state law for ICE agents, for example, to be in force arrayed with weapons outside polling places in Minnesota?
No, it would not. Our state law is super, super clear. The only one who can be within 100 feet of the entrance of a polling place is a voter, an election worker, or someone who naturally works in that building, a church, a school, a city hall, or whatever it is. The only exception to that is each political party can send one challenger, only one, not a swarm of 20, one per political party. Other than that, you're out. And we have an explicit law in Minnesota that says that there can be no preemptive posting of law enforcement in or outside or around a polling place. You can always respond to a call, of course, if someone faints in the polling place or pulls a gun or whatever, which I'm not predicting, it's not going to happen. But if that happens, of course they can respond. But you can't say, no local government can say, boy, things have been a little tense in the XYZ neighborhood. Let's put a couple cops outside of the polling place just to be safe when it opens. You can't do that under Minnesota law. And that means all law enforcement. What the feds would do, it's anyone's guess.
And I understand that in Minnesota, it is legal to carry a gun into a polling place. Should it be? And is that something the legislature ought to address?
I say yes, they absolutely should. I mean, one of the sad realities of our world is that there's been as many mass shootings as there have been days in a year. We know that based on our own experience as Minnesotans. So why you would not make that place one where people are free of intimidation, I think is a mistake and it needs to be fixed. I wanted to add that it was I think it was the year 2020 when we had to launch an investigation into a private security company that was recruiting armed security guards from other states like Tennessee to come up to Minnesota to to stand around polling places with guns. This company called Atlas Aegis, we sued them and got into a consent decree with them because they knew that they were, I think, in the wrong. But this company was recruiting people to go from their state to Minnesota to try to post up around election places. So we're more than ready this time around. We're preparing. We're getting out there early. And I will also add one more point. I used to lament the fact that in America, we had not 50 different election systems. We had different systems by county.
Mhm.
Some of y'all will remember the 2000 election in Florida, where from one county to another, the ballots were a little different. Now, this diversity in election systems may be a strength
Mhm.
because it's really hard to rig an election in the United States because it is decentralized. You all will remember how the president was trying to find 11,000 and some more votes in Georgia. It turns out that Republican or Democrat, Democrat or Republican or Green Party or Independent, our election officials take what they're doing very seriously. And I just want to say that that is a strength. And I hope everybody on this call considers volunteering as an election judge or being part of our election system. And because that helps maintain the level of integrity that we're so used to.
Yeah, I know Secretary Simon, you often mention it takes 30,000 people to run an
Yep.
election in Minnesota. It's awfully hard to rig something that involves that many people.
It's that many people, and I think Keith is exactly right. We have a spread out, decentralized system. Some people are under the mistaken impression that our office counts votes. As I'm sure many on this call know, we don't count votes. We post on our website what other people count, but on election day, we never touch anyone's ballot. That happens in thousands of places, in townships and cities and counties across the state of Minnesota. And I think that's a good thing. We have a bottom-up system, not a top-down system. So it would take, let's put it this way. To rig an election, a statewide election in Minnesota, a lot of people would have to be in on it, right? This isn't Ocean's 11 with like 11 people in the casino plotting the heist, right? This is like hundreds upon hundreds, probably thousands would have to be in on it because it is so decentralized. We take in what other people count, but we don't do the actual counting. It's bottom up, not top down.
Well, you mentioned the issue of vote counting, and that reminds me of the conversation I had recently with one of Minnesota's election gurus, Joe Mansky, now retired from Ramsey County. And he said what he's concerned about is not so much what happens on election day or at the polling place, though there might be some things to worry about there, but rather what happens afterwards with the ballots. President Trump last week made some comment about how he wished he had sent in the military to confiscate the ballots after the 2020 election. Could he do that in 2026? Could he do that in Minnesota? And can we somehow get ahead of him?
He can try, but we will be in court with him immediately, and there's no legal basis to do that. There's simply no legal basis for that. And quite honestly, what military would he get? We'd be in court if he tried to get the enlisted active armed forces. If he tried to get our National Guard, we'd be in court on that too. So honestly, I see that as a very dubious proposition. But I just want to say to everybody, and I agree with Steve. We don't want to fearmonger, or we don't want to make people nervous. But we do need to be ready for anything.
Mm-hmm.
We do need to be ready for anything, and that means organizing, planning, scenario mapping now. And so that's why, Lori, you all pulling this meeting together tonight is like really important. Some people going to protest, some people going to litigate, people are going to do whatever they're best at and enjoy doing. But to know that we have a group of people dedicated to clean elections, thinking about it in January is definitely to our benefit.
Huge. And can I just add on to that? He's absolutely right. And I would say, remember, just from a mechanical standpoint, for those who are anxious about election day, meaning the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, going to a particular place at a particular time during particular hours, remember, that's not the only way to vote in Minnesota. It just bears repeating. I know we all know this in the back of our minds, but for those who are nervous about it, I just had a conversation this morning with some folks on a voter outreach call. Remember, that's one way to vote in polling place on election day. The two other ways to vote are early absentee in person, usually at a city hall or a community center or a county courthouse or what have you, or have the ballot come to you. Have the vote from your couch, vote from your kitchen table, order the ballot to come to you. Our website is mnvotes.gov. You can go order that ballot to you. You don't have to go anywhere. And increasingly, Minnesotans are voting by absentee. Last election in 2024, 39% voted absentee. So it was 61-39, but that's a good chunk, nearly 40%, climbing up towards half, are choosing not to do it on game day, on election day in a particular place. They're choosing to do it in some form beforehand.
A very popular option. I think that's an exciting change in Minnesota, especially given how long it took us to get to that no excuses absentee voting. I think Joan Grow proposed it in 1987, and it was finally passed in 2013. So it's a while in Minnesota to get these things done. Well, at the root of all these federal moves, or at least so the Trump administration has said, is a belief that people who are ineligible people are voting in our elections in big numbers. And I wonder what you say to that charge. Is there any truth to that allegation that we can cite evidence for, that there's big numbers of ineligible people voting?
Well, let me just say, it's a serious question and a fair question. Every Minnesotan should ask that question and should be satisfied that the answer is that the system is secure, and it is secure. How do we know that? A couple ways. Minnesota law is very strict on this point. If a citizen, anyone on this call or at this meeting, or anyone else in Minnesota has a credible claim that someone did something wrong with regard to elections, voting, registration, voting twice, voting across state lines, anything like that, and they turn that over to law enforcement, it must be investigated. Must. Mandatory. There's no discretion. They can't say, well, we're dealing with a bunch of murders. We'll get to it in 6 months. They have to investigate it. Then they have to report the results of those investigations to our office, whether it results in a charge or not, or a conviction or not. So we see all the data. And I can tell you that the level of misconduct on the voting front in Minnesota is microscopic. Now, let me take one particular variant of that because it's been in the news a lot, so I'm just going to name it. to the Elon Musks of the world and everyone else, alleging or outright saying that in Minnesota and elsewhere, there's a lot of undocumented people or non-citizens voting in Minnesota and elsewhere. To this, I say, look at the article that was written by a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas in the summer of 2024, so about a year and a half ago. You can Google it. And he wrote an op-ed about it in the Star-Tribune. He looked at 10 years worth of voting in Minnesota from 2014 to 2024. 13.3 million ballots were cast in that 10-year period. Okay, so it's 10 years, 13.3 million ballots. He looked at all the public records and he found examples of provable election fraud perpetrated by non-citizens. You know how many he found? Three. Now, that is three too many. Our standard, our goal is perfection. I want it to be zero. I wish it was zero. It's three, not zero. But let's put that in some rational perspective. 3 out of 13.3 million over 10 years. That is a very, very clean and honest system. So it's not perfect. We can always do better, of course, and we're always looking to do better. But those are the numbers, at least that we have.
What does that fraud picture look like from your perspective, Attorney General Ellison? Is there a problem with fraud in Minnesota elections as you perceive it?
No. So I have that. No is a complete sentence, and you're a journalist, so you know about sentences, right? No is a complete sentence. The answer is no. This is, and again, this. I'm just going to be direct. This is a false statement designed to scare people into changing the system that other people think is going to advantage them in an election. This is not about an election. This is about politics. This is about restricting the vote and limiting the number of people who get to participate. We very clearly, we have a very secure system. And we all should be proud of it because it has such massive participation. But this claim of I've heard people say, oh, there's a bunch of, they call them illegal aliens voting in the election. I'm like, well, did you report that? And to who? And when? And people will prosecute these cases when they do happen. On the rare occasion that they happen, people are held accountable for it. So it's not true, and it's a misstatement. And again, this is not to say no one ever voted, when they shouldn't have. But it's to say that it's so infrequent that it makes no statistical difference, and so that's the real truth. If you're dealing with human beings, again, we're aiming for perfection, but you're really not going to get it. But we have extremely good election integrity in the state of Minnesota, and I think that that's something that I'm really proud of.
Well, it strikes me that either by design or by coincidence, by unintended consequence, the consequence is a lack of trust in our democratic process.
Right.
And in some that could suppress the vote by itself. It could also just make people more cynical about all that government does, if that's the attitude. And I wonder what you think about the lack of trust that it has been exhibited in our electorate through these kinds of charges, and what do you think people of goodwill and good devotion to democracy ought to do about all that? Why don't you talk about that for a bit, Attorney General Ellison, and then I'll turn to Secretary Simon.
Well, I think we really need to double down on public education. I think we need look, as Minnesotans, we don't like to tell people that they're lying or that they're making up things or what they're saying isn't true. We don't like to do that because it seems a little not that polite. But I'm sorry, but in your most polite Minnesota way, we're going to have to say some people are not telling the truth, and are deliberately trying to shake our confidence in our system. And, and it's not just a voting system. Let me just say, anytime someone says the media is fake news, that's trying to shake confidence in our First Amendment. Somebody says our election system is full of fraud and all that. That's not true either. People say that all elected officials are crooked. That's not true. And we've got to just get in the habit of sort of defending institutions that we all used to just assume, we're stable and trusted. That's just the space that we're in right now. because there are some folks who think that somehow shaking confidence in American institutions is to their advantage, but it's to our collective disadvantage. So thank you for writing and thanks for having this meeting tonight. And let's figure out some more things we can do to help people get the confidence that they need. I just, want to say, Steve said that the question about election integrity was a good one and a fair one, and I think he's right. Let's not run from this question. Let's lean into it, and because there are good answers. People have questions, we got answers, no problem.
How about that, Secretary Simon? Do you think that the trust in our election system in Minnesota has been on the downhill, and what can be done about that?
Well, actually, I'm a glass half full guy on that question for a couple of reasons. First, your newspaper, the Star-Tribune, the last poll that was taken on
I'm retired.
well, okay, your former newspaper did a poll in the fall of 2024, and it found that 79% of Minnesotans had a basic level of confidence in the election system. Now, that's a really high number. It's hard to get 79% of people to agree on anything in a poll these days, like what color the sky is, right?
Secretary Simon,
Yeah.
forgive me for the interruption. I'm getting a call that is an emergency.
Go for it.
It's not a personal one, it's a work-related one. I am deeply apologetic for having to leave with the call, but maybe I can rejoin. But for now, I'm going to have to excuse myself.
We understand.
No problem, Keith.
Thank you, Keith. Okay, thank you.
I was going to say, so number one was the poll result, 79%, and that's an impressively high number for any system or any poll. The second reason, just anecdotally, that I think we know that generally speaking, there's a base level of confidence is voter turnout. I'm not suggesting that our sky-high voter turnout means that everyone who turns out at those high levels endorses and agrees with every part of our election system. That would be foolish and unfair to say. There are people who vote who think they'd like to add some laws or subtract some laws or make some changes to our election system. So I'm not saying it's an endorsement of everything, but let's use some common sense here. If our system was really riddled with fraud and corruption, everyday people would not vote in these sky-high numbers. They just wouldn't. It's not a good use of anyone's time if you think that, if you really believe that your vote won't be counted accurately. It'll be stolen. It will be overcome by other people's frauds. You wouldn't participate at those high levels. So that's not to say we can't make changes or there aren't legitimate disagreements on policy. But at a basic level, I think people know it's honest. People know it's basically clean. And that's a good thing. Now, disinformation is a problem. And here I want to make a distinction, if you don't mind, between disinformation and disagreement. I would never say that someone who disagrees with me on election policy is peddling disinformation. If someone says, has a bone to pick with me or the job I'm doing or doesn't like this law or that law or wants to add something or subtract something, I wouldn't say that person's peddling disinformation. But I define disinformation as someone who is peddling information that is knowingly false. So earlier I said, which I think almost all of us knew anyway, that our office doesn't count votes. That's just a basic fact. We don't do that. There are no semi-trucks going to a big warehouse in St. Paul where our office is counting votes. That's not happening. It's happening in townships and cities and counties all over Minnesota. And yet, if you went right now on your device, a phone, a laptop, or whatever, it would take you 60 seconds of a mildly difficult Google search to find people out on social media saying or implying that I and my colleagues across the country are not only counting the votes, we're spiking the votes or rigging the votes, or we're boosting up turnout or the vote numbers for our favored candidates and lowering or depressing them for the candidates we don't like, and that we're in charge and we're pulling all these strings. That's not a matter of disagreeing with me on voter ID or disagreeing with me on this, that, or the other election issue. That's just peddling garbage. That's just objectively false. That kind of disinformation is out there. It is a problem. But again, I'm a long-term optimist about this. We have a pretty firm base in Minnesota of people who have a fundamental belief in basic fairness of the system.
I've been looking, as you've been speaking here, at some of the questions people have submitted, and thank you to the audience for these good questions. Many of them have already been addressed in our conversation. there's considerable concern among those who are listening about the future of same-day registration. You were right when you said that's a popular option in Minnesota. I remember being at some audiences years ago and asking for a show of hands of how many people had used that option at one point or another in their Minnesota voting career, and by far a majority of hands in the room went up. This has been very popular. How can we help people better understand how it works so as to debunk some of the false claims that are made about its legitimacy? What can we do to improve the public's understanding?
Honestly, and no one told me to say this, and no one knew I would say this, you can support groups like Clean Elections Minnesota. They're walking I totally mean it. They are walking the halls of the Capitol, meeting with legislators, testifying at hearings, providing plain language overviews and explanations of what elections laws are and are not. So if you haven't already, I urge everyone to go to their website, either make a contribution or in one way or another help Clean Elections Minnesota. They are a trusted and reliable and faithful ally to our office, and forget our office, to the cause of free and fair elections. But more broadly than just the one group, I would say that it is about educating people. It used to be said, as you know, Tip O'Neill famously said, all politics is local. I'm not the first to say this, that's been turned on its head. All politics are really national now. They're not so local. So you have national figures, whether it's Elon Musk or Tucker Carlson or this, that, or the other pundit, saying things about same-day voter registration or vouching or whatever, and it's pretty clear that they don't fully understand what it is that they're attacking. So when you tell people that same-day voter registration, for example, is just showing you are who you say you are, and you live where you say you live, only you can do it on game day. There's no 1 month cutoff like there is in most states. It makes sense to them. And when you tell them how it mechanically works and how there are checks built in before, during, and after the election, they come to understand its usefulness and what a mainstream thing it has been over the years. This is not some niche boutique service that some small entitled sliver of the electorate takes advantage of. There have been times in our history over the last 50 years where hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people used it for all the right and good reasons that the legislature intended.
Well, and say just a little more about those mechanics. You come in and you register either with a new ID, form of physical ID, or with a vouching. What is the follow-up to be sure that you didn't tell a lie about that?
Yeah, there is follow-up. And fortunately, our voter registration database in Minnesota is very up to date. How up to date? Literally every day of the week, 7 days a week, it is being checked against multiple databases. We check against immigration databases, public safety databases, residency and change in address and postal service databases. We check it against two, not one, but two death databases, believe it or not. It's a morbid subject, but we run all of those things through the Social Security Death Index and the Minnesota Department of Health Death Index. A little morbid, I realize, but that's what we do. So it's really up to the minute information and data, and it's all filtered and screened through that.
And if you find that someone has committed a falsehood, there are
Yes.
severe penalties. Am I right about
Oh,
that?
yes, it's a felony. It's a felony. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no discretion. It's one of the few crimes in Minnesota law. We don't have that with serious violent crimes, where if there's evidence of the sufficient to investigate, it must be investigated. There's no discretion. And I think that law was put in like literally generations ago, and it was a way to make sure that county attorneys weren't being political and looking the other way at their favored candidates, mischief or something like that. So there's no discretion. Zero.
Exactly.
Can't say we're too busy with these 3 murder cases. They've got to do it.
Well, and one of our audience members says, would you please go through the same kind of explanation with regard to the friend or relative who says, aren't there a lot of non-citizens voting in Minnesota? What kind of information can you arm our audience with about
Well,
that?
as I mentioned earlier, there's the St. Thomas article. I invite everyone to take a look at it. And the name of the professor is escaping me. I've met him. But he did this piece in the summer of 2024, 10 years worth of voting, 2014 to 2024, 11.3 million voters. Wait, was it 11.3? 13.3, excuse me, 13.3 million voters over 10 years. And he found 3 non-citizens. 3.
How would your office go about detecting a non-citizen registration and attempt to vote?
Yeah, well, it's typically done at the local level because the statewide voter registration system is a bottom-up thing. It's done at the county level,
Okay.
and they would typically discover it there and then report to us what they've discovered.
And they would count that by doing that, just by checking against new registrants would be checked against existing databases.
That's right.
Okay, that's helpful information. I did mention earlier that we have another legislative session about to start in a few weeks. And I wonder if there is anything in this realm that you'll be asking the legislature to consider doing to get us better prepared for what could be coming in this
Well,
election.
there are many legislative hands on this call, to be sure. Ken Peterson among them, who know the legislature well. And they know that, number one, it's going to be a short session this year. You know this, of course, Lori, better
Yes.
than anyone on this call, me included. It's going to be a short session. It's an evenly, closely divided session by way of political parties. They're going to want to probably get out of there and get to the doors and all the rest. Plus, the legislature has a tradition, for all the right reasons, regardless of who's in charge, of not wanting to make really big election law changes in an election year unless they're going to put the effective date out to another elections. You don't want to start messing with, in a big way, with the rules of the game just months before you actually have the election. And so there probably won't be, I'm just saying, a lot of the tectonic plates shifting in terms of elections. But let me just tell you about one thing that we're working on that's a longer term project. So I travel a lot around the state of Minnesota. And I ask people about voting and why they're on the fence about voting and what they wish they had when they were voting. And one thing that's come through the last few years in particular is, and particularly among young people, they feel that they don't have enough information about candidates. Now, of course, they do when it comes to presidential candidates or gubernatorial candidates. That's easy. But school board, county commissioner, judicial candidates, and the like, they're thirsting for information. So one thing that other states have done is put out a voter guide. The state of California, for example, mails one of those to every household, not every person, but every household. Other states only put it online. And so we've been engaging legislators in a longer term discussion about what we could do in Minnesota to that effect. It can be expensive. If you're mailing to millions of homes, I don't care what postal rate you get, that's a lot of money. And so we want to make sure we do it right. But it's a way to arm people with information that they say they want, particularly for local races that don't get traditionally and typically a lot of media coverage. That would be a voter guide where we wouldn't editorialize. Obviously, we would, as the other states have done, leave a few square inches per candidate, whatever it might be, in a particular race to say something about themselves, a photo, some bullet points, some paragraphs, some attributes, something like that, to engage voters. So that's something we're talking about in the longer term. But in terms of other things, honestly, I just want to right size expectations given the shortness of the session, the close partisan division, the proximity to the election. Don't be looking for necessarily for any big headline grabbers this session when it comes to election law.
Will you ask the legislature to ban guns in polling places?
So this is an issue that we have been engaged with the legislature on for a long time, and I will be honest with you about this. The conventional wisdom is that until and unless you have the votes to do a bill like that, trotting it out for a hearing it runs the risk of getting more of the thing that you're trying to alleviate. In other words, you can well imagine the reaction to even a bill or a hearing being a call for people to bring their guns to the polling place.
Planting an idea where you don't want to plant it.
Right, exactly. So in this particular climate, it's unlikely.
Well, understandable. All right, we're getting close to the end of my list here. Questions? I think we've covered most of this. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Secretary Simon, and for your answers. And I know Keith Ellison would have liked to have stayed with us. We'll be interested to know what has taken him away from us. And we appreciate the support of Clean Elections Minnesota for this program. I don't know if it's mine to say goodnight or if Mary Hartnett wants to jump back in to do so, but I want to say thank you to our audience for their attention and wish everyone a good, safe night and a good, safe and clean election this year.